When an adult avoids connection, it is tempting to label them as distant, guarded, or emotionally unavailable. But psychologically, avoidance is rarely a sign of coldness. It is a learned survival response. The human psyche adapts to its environment, and when closeness repeatedly brings disappointment, betrayal, or emotional neglect, the mind learns to associate connection with danger. Withdrawal then becomes a form of self-preservation, not because the person lacks the capacity to love or attach, but because they have learned, often unconsciously, that intimacy comes at a cost. Over time, this strategy solidifies into identity. The adult tells themselves they are better alone, low maintenance, or not wired for closeness, when in truth, they are simply protecting an inner world that was once exposed and left unprotected. Jung understood this well. What we call personality is often just a pattern of defenses shaped by experience. The psyche does not ask whether avoidance brings fulfillment. It only asks whether it prevents pain. But survival strategies are not meant to become life sentences. What once kept you safe can later keep you isolated. And the deeper work begins when we ask not, why don't I connect? But rather, what did I have to survive by disconnecting? That question alone can begin to loosen the armor. What often appears as emotional strength or radical independence is, in many adults, the quiet result of long-term emotional fatigue. These are people who learned early that relying on others led to disappointment, so they cultivated self-sufficiency not as a virtue, but as a necessity. Over time, independence becomes a badge of honor, yet beneath it lies a deep weariness, the exhaustion of always having to carry one's emotional weight alone. Psychologically, the mind adapts by narrowing its needs. The adult tells themselves they do not require closeness, support, or reassurance, not because these needs vanished, but because repeatedly unmet needs are too painful to acknowledge. Jung would describe this as a subtle dissociation from one's own vulnerability. The person functions, achieves, and survives, yet remains internally drained. Connection is avoided not due to fear alone, but because it feels like another demand on an already depleted inner system. True resilience is not the absence of need, but the capacity to recognize it without shame. Emotional fatigue eases only when one allows rest, not just from tasks, but from perpetual self-reliance. And perhaps the most courageous act for the emotionally independent adult is not standing alone, but allowing themselves to lean, even briefly, without feeling weak. Trust is not lost in a single moment. It is slowly unlearned through repetition. When betrayal, emotional inconsistency, or abandonment occurs again and again, the psyche adapts by revising its internal map of relationships. The adult no longer asks, "Can I trust this person?" but rather assumes at a deeper level that closeness itself is unreliable. This is how past wounds quietly reshape present behavior. From a Jungian perspective, the unconscious remembers what the conscious mind tries to rationalize away. Even when an adult claims they have moved on, the psyche retains the emotional memory of what happened when they once opened themselves fully. Vulnerability becomes associated with loss, and distance begins to feel like wisdom. The individual may still desire connection, but desire is overridden by a deeper instinct to avoid repeating the same psychological injury. This rewiring of trust is not pessimism. It is the mind attempting to maintain coherence and safety. Yet the danger lies in allowing yesterday's betrayals to dictate tomorrow's possibilities. Healing begins when one distinguishes between memory and reality, between what was and what is. The task is not to erase the past, but to prevent it from unconsciously governing the present. Awareness, in this sense, becomes the first act of courage. For many adults who avoid connection, the choice of solitude is not rooted in superiority or detachment, but in the exhaustion of being misunderstood. Repeatedly explaining oneself, only to feel unseen or emotionally dismissed, leaves a quiet residue in the psyche. Over time, the individual learns that silence feels safer than speech, and distance more peaceful than constant misinterpretation. Solitude becomes a place where one's inner life no longer needs translation. Jung spoke often of the pain that arises when the inner world has no mirror in the outer one. When a person's thoughts, values, or emotional depth are consistently met with indifference or simplification, they begin to withdraw, not to disappear, but to preserve meaning. Being alone in this context is not loneliness, it is relief. It allows the self to remain intact, unedited, and unchallenged by those who cannot or will not listen deeply. Yet solitude, while protective, can quietly harden into isolation if left unexamined. The work is not to abandon one's inner world, but to seek environments and relationships capable of meeting it. Connection does not require constant explanation, only recognition. And when understanding replaces effort, solitude no longer has to serve as a refuge, but a choice rather than a necessity. Adults who avoid connection are often misunderstood as emotionally distant, when in truth, they experience emotion with unusual intensity. The difference lies not in what they feel, but in what they choose to reveal. Over time, these individuals learn that unfiltered emotional expression can invite misunderstanding, judgment, or exploitation. As a result, they develop a refined selectivity, sharing not less emotion, but less access. From a psychological standpoint, this is not repression, it is discernment shaped by experience. Jung recognized that the inner world is sacred, and when it is exposed without safety, the psyche responds by erecting boundaries. These adults observe carefully, listen deeply, and assess quietly before allowing another person close. Emotional depth remains intact, but it is guarded, much like a valuable resource that must be protected from careless handling. The danger arises when selectivity becomes invisibility, when the fear of misinterpretation silences even authentic connection. Healing does not require emotional excess, nor does it demand total openness. It begins with learning that vulnerability can be measured, intentional, and reciprocal. When expression is shared with those who have earned understanding, emotional depth becomes a bridge rather than a burden. And perhaps the question to reflect on is not why am I guarded, but who has proven worthy of what I carry within. Avoidance does not dissolve through force, persuasion, or self-criticism. It softens only in the presence of safety. The psyche opens when it no longer feels the need to defend itself. For the adult who has learned to survive through distance, healing begins not by tearing down defenses, but by encountering relationships where those defenses are no longer required. Jung understood that the unconscious moves toward wholeness when it feels contained, not threatened. Safety in this sense is not perfection or certainty. It is consistency. It is being met without having to perform, explain, or protect oneself. When emotional safety is experienced even briefly, the nervous system recalibrates. The mind learns that connection does not always demand sacrifice or self-erasure. Slowly, avoidance loses its function, not because the person forces themselves to change, but because the old strategy is no longer necessary. The deeper transformation occurs when self-protection is replaced by self-trust. The individual no longer asks whether others are safe, but whether they themselves can remain intact within connection. This is the turning point, from avoidance rooted in fear to choice grounded in awareness. And the final reflection is this: connection becomes possible the moment you realize that opening does not mean losing yourself. It means meeting the world without armor.